What is going on, guys? In today's video I will show you the highest rating DPS tier list in Midnight. So we are ranking raid DPS by damage numbers, survivability, utility, and how realistic each spec looks in Midnight rating, where raid buffs and debuffs matter a lot. We'll start at the D tier and climb all the way to the S tier, because some classes are struggling, some are solid, and a few already are looking to break the new raid meta. And if you ever played WoW, then you know that the grind for gold, mounts, items, and ranks can feel endless. And that's where KaidGames comes in. They are a trusted platform used by over 150,000 gamers worldwide. They offer pro-level support in more than top 25 games, including all versions of World of Warcraft. No matter if you need faster start, help with items and dungeons, or just want currency delivered safely and quickly, then KaidGames has you covered. So if you want to skip the grind and play with pros, then click the link description and use my code KaidVow for extra 10% off. Starting in D tier, the Arms Warrior still has the biggest raid issues. He can do decent work in stacked to target situations through the sweeping strikes, but even there it does not look special enough. The single target is merely fine, and the real AoV still asks for too much investment and sacrifice. Even after the recent awkward nerf and then buff again, the arm still looks weak and needs much more help before serious raid groups will feel good about bringing it. Next up we have Beast Mastery Hunter that opens the C tier with its usual full mobility and range niche, and this always gives its value. The problem is that raids does not reward this advantage enough. Midnight did widen the mobility gap, but Beast Mastery still does not turn that into a top damage. The Hunter's Mark redesign helps on 2 target fights, though overall spec still looks too fair compared to the range specs above it. Next up, Balanced Druid also lands in the C tier, and the story is familiar. The new Midnight rework feels better, but the raid problem remains simple. Single target still looks too weak. Balance gets more appeal when spread damage and multi-dotting matter, yet in the high-end mythic environment the overall package still looks below average, especially once the stronger ranged raid specs will start doing the same job just more efficiently. Next up, Frost Death Knight stays in the C tier because the cleave niche that it wants is just too contested. Frost still likes the extra targets it can hit for free, and it remains very durable in progression, but Unholy simply looks stronger in too many of the same places. Midnight kept the Frost comfortable and familiar, though comfort alone is not enough when your teammates is doing much more with the same raid spot. Then Enhancement Summon also sits in the C tier, but it still feels too expensive. Midnight gave it a major rework and 2 damage buffs through Totemic and the Stormbringer, but the more explosive options will sacrifice too much single target for the raid. On top of that, Enhancement remains one of the squishier melee specs after defensive pruning. The Sky Fury is a real raid reason to want a shaman, but most groups can get the same buff through easier alternatives. Next we have Outlaw Rogue that sits here because his damage numbers are too flat. Midnight changes preserve the core feel, but the spec still does not exploit the burst windows or burn phases, as well as the other rogue options. Sustain single target and cleave are respectable, yet this tier rewards sharper damage shapes. So Rogue utility always keeps Outlaw playable, though compared to the Assassination and Subtlety, it still struggles to justify a raid spot. And now finally, closing out the C tier, we have Affliction Warlock. The spread pressure can look appealing, especially if ads live long enough to matter, but the single target ramp asks for too much and pays back too little. Midnight gave Affliction a clearer identity, again through the Unstable Affliction, which will help the spec, but in real raid fights it still looks too slow. The Warlock's utility and natural tankiness keep it decent, just not strong enough to move it in the higher tier. Then kicking off the B tier, we have Demonology Warlock that still looks good, just not great. For Midnight raiding, the spec got nerfed in a meaningful way, and that matters a lot because cleaner cooldown execution is huge in progress. The reason the demo is not higher is because of the recent aura nerf, combined with the raid DPS numbers that are much closer to destruction. It is still strong on paper and very viable, just no longer the automatic S tier pick that it once seemed. The next Arcane Mage lands in the B tier because while the damage tools are still real, the nerfs and defensive losses change how safe it feels. Arcane can still hit hard in both AoV and priority situations, but raid progression is not only about numbers. Midnight made mages much more fragile, and Arcane now has to rotate every defensive carefully. It remains dangerous, though no longer feels like an easy top-end answer that it looked earlier. Next, the Windwalker Monk sits in the B tier because there's a lot to like, but not enough to break higher, at least for now. Midnight replaced Storm, Earth and Fire with the Zenith, which should make core cooldowns feel cleaner. The raid damage damage tuning also looks healthy too. The bigger issue is that the Windwalker's raid value will always depend on somewhat on the Brewmaster and the Mistweaver, since all three specs bring Mystic Touch. This keeps it good, though not fully meta on its own. Next up, Shadow Priest sits in the B tier because the damage numbers are useful, but the fight conditions may not always be optimized. Shadow likes multiple targets that live long enough to matter, especially with priority target to lean into, and the raid does have some of that. The downside, however, is the movement. Midnight hurt range mobility across the board, but Shadow fell especially hard. Fortitude is great, though Priest healers often already covered that buff anyway. Next up we have Elemental Shaman. Midnight pruned this spec heavily, but the core loop still feels satisfying, and the talent flexibility will help a lot. The issue is that Elemental's best identity right now looks more of an AoV leaning than pure single target, and raid progression often punishes that a lot. Sky Fury helps, and the ranged Shaman slots more naturally into many raid comps than Enhancement does, but overall, Elemental still looks really good. Then Fury Warrior is another B tier spec that feels solid without feeling terrifying. It is comfortable to play, durable for progression, and Battle Shout always gives a warrior a baseline reason to exist in the raid. The problem is that damage still looks too middle of the pack. Fury can absolutely do his job, especially with a good player, but it doesn't currently look like a spec that shapes the mythic. Next up, Assassination Rogue belongs in the B tier because the strengths are real, but raid still exposes his weaknesses. Midnight slow the spec down and clean up the energy flow, which helps with the downtime outside the cooldowns, but when the ads spawn and the raid wants immediate damage, Assassination still has to ramp bleeds and poisons before truly joining the party. Rogue utility remains valuable, but Assassination still looks more steady than scary in this first raid tier. Next up, Fire Mage is in the B tier, and it's close to being higher but not quite there. Midnight moved more of the spec's power back into combustion, which is great for raids because burst windows will matter. Fire also keeps more mobility than the other mage specs. The issue, however, is competition. Arcane looks stronger in many AoV fights, the Frost looks better on 1 and 2 targets, and Fire is still left searching for a niche. Then for one of the last ones we have Survival Hunter that stays in the B tier, even though the raw damage looks tempting. On paper there's a real argument for putting it higher, because it performs well across many target counts, and benefits from the stronger Hunter's mark. The reason that it remains here is the history. Survival has looked promising before raid release, and then fell truly to claim those spots, so it may finally break the pattern, but right now it stays in the B tier. And finally we have Subtlety Rogue that stands in the B tier, with a much more bursty DPS numbers and cleaner, much more overall playstyle. Moving away from the frequent symbol windows and into a stronger 90-second cycle gives the spec a more understandable raid shape. Defensively, Subtlety is still ahead of the other rogue specs, and that matters in progression. Still, while it clearly has value and useful burst, it does not quite have the full package of the spec above in the A tier. Then now moving into the A tier, and first we have the Frost Mage, which is one of the stronger raid specs because it combines strong single target, useful 2-target cleave through the Splitting Ice, plus the Arcane Intellect. Midnight reworked the spec around the Shatter interactions, which gives it a more structured gameplay loop. The main risk is the Ray of Frost being vulnerable to force movement, but even with this weakness, Frost still looks like a spec that many top raider groups will gladly bring. Then next up, Retribution Paladin earns an A tier, because even though the raw damage numbers are not insane, the total raid package is attractive. The Devotion aura alone guarantees a Paladin slot somewhere, and the raid remains one of the easiest specs to execute during stressful progression. Retribution also tends to outperform early when the raids are messy and the players are dying, because the rotation is stable and forgiving. So even without a giant ceiling, its practical value is huge. Then next, Feral Druid comes into the A tier with much more momentum than usual. Midnight simplified the spec somewhat and gave it a massive late buff, which pushed it near the top. We are still stopping short of the S tier, because Feral does have few structural problems, like limited raid utility beyond the mark of the wild and less comfort in spread cleave mechanics. But if the balance stays this high, then Feral's very close to becoming meta. Then next, Destruction Warlock is one of the most appealing raid specs in Midnight, because raid fights favor the changing target counts, and Cleave Deathstroke handles this well. His pure single target is not the best look, but the raid purely rewards pure single target anyway. On top of that, Warlock's utility is always amazing in progression. The Gateway, Summons, Solvel, and the natural tankiness all add up to a spec that feels easy to dominate. Then Havoc Demon Hunter makes an A tier because Chaos Brand is still mandatory enough that Demon Hunter representation matters a lot, and Havoc itself has real strengths. Its single target and AoV are both solid, while the buffed Alderchi priority damage niche could become useful on certain fights. The darkness is also meaningful in raid utility. The presence of Devourer hurts the Havoc a little, but he still brings enough damage, survivability and support to justify a strong raid ranking. Then next, Marksmanship counter lands in the A tier because Midnight solved several awkward issues and left it very stable for raid. The redesigned Hunter's Mark is a huge deal, especially on multi-target fights, and his burst AoV remains one of the most appealing tools in the class. It's not as mobile as the Beast Mastery, but compared to the most ranger specs, it still handles all mechanics very easy. And now finally, Augmentation Evoker is one of the hardest specs to rank, but A tier feels right. Midnight massively changed how Augmentation works in raid, with a Bone Might now affecting all DPS instead of forcing awkward mechanics. This makes the spec much more approachable and more dependent on what the rest of the raid is doing. If cooldown timing and burst windows will line up well, then Augmentation could shut up quickly, but if not, then it still looks decent. And now finally, moving into the S tier, and Devourer Demon Hunter is here, because it checks almost every box that you want from a raid DPS in a new expansion. The damage looks strong, the raid buff is mandatory, and betting against the newest spec is usually a mistake. Even when the players are still learning it, these specs often land overtuned or get buffed fast. Defensively he's not perfect, but with all the DPS he's for sure meta. And next, Devastation Evoker also lands in the S tier, because its damage numbers will fit this raid perfectly. The spec is especially strong on 2-target cleave, and on hitting adds as they appear, and those exactly is the situation that matters here. Midnight changed its cooldown rhythm to Dragon Rage and Rising Fury, and while the 25-yard range limitation can still be painful, the raw output, durability and movement will create a terrifying package. And now finally, we have the Unholy Dead Knight that closes out the S tier, because despite a tuning rollercoaster, it still looks like one of the best raid DPS specs in this patch. Midnight reworked the spec heavily by adding more pet-based and deceased-based identity, and even through all the nerfs and the buffs, it came out looking excellent on single target. The anti-magic zone matters, and Dead Knights are naturally durable for progression, so Unholy is simply too strong to be anything else than meta.